Damon and I are going to talk today about Pluto and City of Yes and how we're turning legislation from City Council into data. Damon, next slide, please. Just by way of brief introduction, this is Damon and I and our cats. And since we're talking, probably one of these little chaos agents will make an appearance on our monitors at some point. But so we work for city planning. City planning, if you're not familiar, is responsible for planning and construction growth and development of New York City. But over and above that, we have a research agency role, and we supply data to a broad range of planning functions and stakeholders. And we have a very long history of doing geographic data. And so that's the agency, and just as a team, data engineering is currently just Damon and I, and we produce some of DCP's more popular data products like Pluto, the subject of today's talk, and facilities and housing databases. And we're the open source team at DCP, and I would wager the New York City government at large. And if you think you're more open source than New York, talk to us. We'd love to get to know you. But so we heavily in Python and PostGIS and DBT. And we write our own code, and we like to maintain our own infrastructure. And next slide, please. So what are we talking about today? So just the TLDR, we're going to add some new cities to Pluto, maintain relevant to the City of Yes legislation that was passed by the City Council recently. And the data that we're adding is relevant to transit zones and MIH areas. The talk's just going to be split up into two parts. One, an intro, a primer, non-technical, and then going through the process of actually adding these fields. So we're going to start with just what are we adding and why? And very briefly, what is Pluto? I assume that you signed up for a talk about Pluto, so you have probably a brief glancing familiarity with it. But if not, we've got you covered. And then what is City of Yes? And then what are transit zone and MIH areas? And then we're actually going to dive into the process of adding these to Pluto. So starting with transit zones and then MIH areas. And I think this part of the talk is potentially interesting from a data perspective of just with any data set, you'll find quirks. Things won't necessarily line up how you would expect them to. And so we learned a lot adding these. And I think you, potentially the audience, as users of this data, you might encounter some of these quirks as well. And so next slide, please. And just by way of backdrop for all of this, I need to go pay my rent after this talk, and puts me in the mind that the city is in a historic housing crisis. And so you may be aware that the City Council passed City of Yes for housing opportunity about a year ago to alleviate the shortage. And the necessary, the salient points of that for us right now at this talk is that first, this legislation aims to promote housing development by easing parking restrictions. City planning is often trying to roll back overly restrictive space zoning requirements. And again, I would wager that many on this talk are familiar with, say, Donald Shoup and just how expensive parking is, even if it is, in scare quotes, free. And it's one aspect that's relevant to this talk for transit zones. And then, so supposing we actually do spur more housing development, certain of these new developments will legally require affordable units, and that's pertaining to the MIH areas data set. And as it happens, we at City Planning maintain data sets for both of these. Next slide, please. We're going to layer that data into Pluto. So in the next release of Pluto, for every tax lot, we'll be computing the transit zone for a tax lot. This largely determines parking construction minimums. And we're going to be layering in MIH areas. This determines for a given lot how much affordable housing would be required for new development. And so why add them to Pluto? So just for context, DCP maintains data sets and tools like what you're seeing at the top, which is Zola. This is sort of a sister tool or data set to Pluto. And our existing data sets and tools are very good at answering questions like, hey, okay, say I've selected this very specific unit. That's that dark blue square in Zola. For that specific unit, what are the parking and affordable unit requirements for just this lot? That makes it difficult to answer questions in aggregate. So what we'd like to enable at a data set level, and I'm not adding this to this sort of aggregate functionality that Zola is just the data set level in Pluto. We want to enable, researcher, planners, developers, analysts to answer questions like, hey, what are all the tax lots that I can develop without new parking required? And in this certain mandatory inclusionary housing option. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned you probably know what Pluto is, but just in case you don't, Pluto stands for Primary Land Use Tax Output. And this is a data set that has geographic and land use data for every lot in New York City. This is nearly 1 million rows of tax lots, and we aim to release this monthly with quarterly updates that are a little more sizable. And so I'm going to pass it over to Damon, who's going to talk through what even is the City of Yes and MIH and transit zones.
Hey everybody, and yes, my cat is here, like Alex predicted, and I wasn't even talking. So I'm going to do my best to give the side of things that we don't usually work on, which is the zoning resolution and the relevant terms. Big disclaimer here, we are data engineers. We are not the zoning team, the housing team, or the transportation team. And so you're going to get a generalized, I hope the housing team isn't here, borderline offensive to their expertise sense of the things we're talking about, but it is certainly useful to get the backgrounds. Like Alex said, City of Yes, one of the 3 City of Yes initiatives was housing opportunity, a citywide zoning text amendment that aimed to enable a little more housing in every neighborhood. Some of the proposals in CHO, as we call it sometimes, were related to transit-oriented development and affordable housing. So transit zone. The history is that most new developments required off-street parking when the zoning resolution came into effect in 1961. Now, the amount of required parking for a site is based on its location and the proposed use. In general, there are 4 zones across the city, and I'm about to show you those 4 zones. So we have, hopefully you can see my mouse, the Manhattan Core and Long Island City zone, inner transit zone, and the outer transit zone. Anyone from our transportation team is here. They're already upset at what I just said because I'm oversimplifying what is truly going on here. But in general, if someone wants to know how much parking is required for a new development in New York City, these 4 zones are what's relevant. So in the Manhattan Core, no parking is required for any proposed use. In the inner transit zone, that zone does not require parking for residential and often non-residential developments. In the outer transit zone, only requires parking for large residential and some non-residential developments. Everywhere else generally requires parking for most residential and non-residential development. Like I said, there are, of course, more details and thankfully numbers associated with these things when people really need to know what's required. But generally speaking, this is what transit zones are about. So, mandatory inclusionary housing, or MIH. It was adopted in 2016. It's a program that encourages the creation of affordable housing at a range of incomes in areas planned for housing growth. When zoning actions significantly increase residential development, the City Planning Commission, part of the Department of City Planning, and the City Council can apply one or more MIH options. In these currently 265 areas, all new residential developments must include a specified amount of permanently affordable housing. What does affordable mean? That's where things get really complicated. So again, an oversimplified description of the 4 MIH options. When someone wants to know how, or needs to know, how much affordable housing is required and what are the income restrictions, meaning if somebody wants to live in this housing, how much income can they make to qualify for this housing? What's the maximum? These are the 4 options. And I'm not going to run through every single number here, but generally speaking, these options were created to give developers and residents a variety of options. So in option 1, the requirement for affordable housing for new development, 25% of the floor area of the new development must be affordable. And what does affordable mean for option 1? That means that on average, 60%, the income restriction is 60% of the median income. If anyone here knows what AMI means, that's what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, we're talking about AMI, useful, federal, but problematic measure of income in New York City. So this is really just to introduce the bare bones description of these 4 options when it comes to MIH. So the zoning resolution and open data is what our team has to start with when it comes to integrating these aspects of land use and lots into Pluto. So these aren't links that I'm expecting anyone to click, but it's really just to show that it's out there and it's knowable. What is MIH and what is the data associated with it? What are transit zones and what is the data associated with it? And this next slide shows you what we were working with really when you click those links. Open data and a whole lot of text where things are technically described and defined. But how do we as data engineers interpret the law and use open data? Well, we can't do it alone. And Alex is going to kick us off to really explain how straightforward, but then of course, more complicated than this process really is.
Thanks, Damon. And luckily, so I'm going to dive into the actual implementation of these fields in Pluto. It's not going to be particularly technical. It's mostly pictures of maps. So if you like pictures of maps in Brooklyn and Queens, we've got you covered. And luckily, so we worked with our transportation and housing teams to add these fields. And we didn't have to parse the law so much. We mostly got on calls with them and showed them confounding examples, and they told us what to do. Apologies for the pun. I thought it was really funny when I proposed it, but seeing it now, I have second thoughts. With transit zones, I'm going to talk through transit zones, and then Damon's going to walk through MIH areas. So, folks like that. Implementing transit zones in Pluto. Like Damon mentioned, there are 4-ish. There's a special 5th zone. And for us, this initially seems like our bread and butter. Typically what we do in Pluto is we take a tax lot. So you can see on the right, we have a random tax lot in Red Hook. And what we typically do in such situations is we say, okay, we pigeonhole this thing geographically into a transit zone. So you're seeing in the light blue, this is the outer transit zone in Red Hook. On the top right, the darker blue, we have the inner transit zone. And I think it's fairly unambiguous where this lot lies. But I want to mention that I've emphasized the word programmatically here because when we do this sort of assignment, it needs to be entirely programmatic. Where we want to avoid as data producers is the case where we have to maintain a list of exceptions. We try to publish Pluto monthly, and the more manual things we need to review is just additional risk to our schedule. For the most part, things slot pretty easily, but as you can imagine, with nearly 1 million lots in the city, we're going to have edge cases where a lot just doesn't fall into a transit zone nicely. So we have these thousands of edge cases, and a lot of them are just easy. So, what you're seeing on the top is you have this lot, this tax lot in orange. There's geometries that Department of Finance gives us. And then you're seeing in that blue line, this is the transit zone boundary. And you can see that this lot is split. Not exactly split, but it's cut by this transit zone. And this is the type of easy case where we feel fairly confident about assigning this lot to a transit zone. But below it, okay, this is a slightly more difficult case. We have a transit zone that cuts a lot. In this case, it was 49% of that lot's area is in the transit zone on the left. 51% is in the transit zone on the right. And so we're immediately faced that, okay, we might need to think a little more deeply about how do we actually assign these things. Even before you do, your intuition might have kicked in that, okay, there's just pure area calculations. You can have a gut sense of where these things, but there's one other variable that we realized we needed to pull in when we assign these things, and that's the tax block, as we call it. So for this highly ambiguous case of this tax lot being split, if you zoom out, we have this block. We have a block field in Pluto. It's part of the BPL, which is the unique identifier for any tax lot. And so if you zoom out, just look at all the lots that are in this block in Pluto, okay, it becomes fairly obvious where this lot should go. It should be assigned in the transit zone on the right. So, yeah, problem solved. When we did this, actually implemented this approach, we still found some fairly strange outliers because briefly, when we talk about what is a lot, we have them in Pluto, and that's great. And they mostly accord with your gut sense of what a block is. But these come from the Department of Finance. And so, for example, every tax lot in the city has a block. For example, City Planning HQ is a block 47 in Manhattan. And if you're looking at, this is a screenshot from Zola of our block, you look at that and say, yes, that's a good block. It's block shaped, it's contiguous. But what we discovered when we popped the hood on Pluto and blocks is that this thing is also a block. So blocks are not in Pluto quite what you might expect. So what you're seeing is Howard Beach. The highlighted blue areas are a block. They're the same block according to the Department of Finance. And for our purposes, they're a problematic block because what you're seeing on the right, that light blue is the outer transit zone, and then the gray is beyond the outer. So this is a block that spans a waterway and is in two different transit zones. Here's another example of what the Department of Finance considers a block. And I'm sure they have great reason for doing so. It doesn't necessarily accord with what we would have in our gut sense as a block. But this is an interesting example also because you can see that orange line. That's a transit zone boundary. And so that's cutting through this particular block. So obviously what we need are actual blocks. And so what we did in Pluto is, so first step for assignment is actually just taking these Department of Finance tax blocks, and a tax block meaning just an aggregate of tax lot geometries. So we just combine all the tax lots and that's your tax block. But we realized we need to actually split these into contiguous blocks. And luckily these mostly fall within, like the contiguous parts of these blocks fall within transit zones neatly. And you're seeing two examples here where in each case, the blue is a block with the Department of Finance. And when we split them, the transit zone cuts through pretty cleanly. This is a not super technical talk. This is the one technical mention I'm going to say is that we love PostGIS and Postgres, but be aware, cluster DB scan, it fails randomly. Anyway, at some point I sent this meme to the group because we tried these different approaches and there were just these sort of confounding blocks. And so even with this split approach, there are confounding edge cases. So even if we do split these blocks into subblocks, we end up with cases like this where, this, what you're seeing on the left is a contiguous block. We have this block that's composed of a bunch of lots, and that thing in the middle is both a transit zone boundary cutting through it, but it's a train track in the middle, and it's classified as an R6 zoning district. That means it looks like to us like a residential property. And so what we realized is just that for cases like this, we actually just need to, sorry, I have to give short shrift to the example on the right, which is even more difficult case. We have this transit zone boundary sneaking straight through both of these cut blocks. What we ended up doing is just dissolving to lots. So if we have blocks that are highly ambiguous like this, we revert to just assigning the lots to a transit zone based on where the lot lies. And so these lots are assigned with no consideration to where their block is. So all told, the outcome, the decision tree looks like something like this. For transit zones, we just take the Department of Finance block and split it into a gut sense of a block. Does that thing slot unambiguously into transit zone? Great. Okay. If not, we dissolve the block back to lots and does it fit ambiguously? And what we end up with just for the outcome is just about 30K in the inner core, 100K in the inner transit zones, and then on the greater 300,000 along with outer transit zones. And then there's a special case that's special 25241. We did mention there were 4, but this is a odd case. Those are the end numbers when we do this. And so you'll notice there's this red box where it just seems like an important unanswered question. You're probably asking but actually no, it's just when we apply this approach, there's just one oddity left over. It's just this auto body shop in Queens the block is split perfectly. The lot is split perfectly. And this is the one oddity, and I would just caution you, if you intend to purchase this lot, develop it into condos, you might have questions about parking on your hands. Yeah, that's transit zones. I think I'm going to hand it back over to Daniel had a question. So we don't do any manual assignment. So we don't have, with this approach, we end up with lots, every single one of them fits unambiguously. But we can talk about what unambiguously means. And I think Damon will talk about ambiguity in all of this in further slides. But the result of this is no manual assignments. So we don't maintain a corrections file or anything like that.
Yep. And that mention of a corrections file is because we have the feature to correct certain values or of lots that we get from Department of Finance and otherwise. It's not something that scales very well. We try and reserve that feature for things that are really important to manually assign. And so that option is there, but thankfully this decision tree and this logic works well enough that we end up with this one lot. And I don't think we ever checked if the owner of this lot works at DCP and contributed to the hand drawing of the transit zones, but we should double check that. I think the answer is no, but thank you, Alex, for walking through what was certainly the harder part of these two categories of new fields. I'm going to talk about mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH areas, which was more straightforward geospatially, but still difficult for other reasons. And so the basic task again was for every lot, let's determine the MIH area and the MIH options associated with it. So what we see on the right is once again a screenshot from Zola. The red areas, we're zoomed in here on the South Bronx. Those red areas are existing MIH areas. Sometimes it's simple. We can see this is a particular MIH area called Westchester Mews, which has option 1, MIH option 1 associated with it. This is near the Parkchester station. And on the right, we've zoomed in on a particular lot that falls within that MIH area. And so we have a pretty unambiguous case here. Sometimes it isn't so simple. On the left, we see that exact same MIH area, a lot that seems to fall within it. And we have the building footprints shown as well. None of the buildings on that lot are in that MIH area. So a little less straightforward. Intuitively, you might go to that lot and say, those buildings are not in the MIH area, and it was drawn around them. So not so simple. And on the right, we just have a very interesting MIH area. I think it's just one strewn about the Bronx Brooklyn. Plenty of those lots might be unambiguous, but I'm guessing from that shape that many of those assignments were just not as simple as we'd like. And so this is a good time to talk about the intersection threshold that we use throughout Pluto. So for all intersection-based Pluto fields, we use a greater than 10% threshold. If a lot's intersection with a relevant zone is greater than 10%, we can programmatically say that lot is associated with that zone. There are some cases where exactly 10% of a lot is covered by an MIH area. And we don't do much rounding during these calculations, so it really is exactly 10%. So since we use this greater than 10% threshold, and we didn't think it would be appropriate for us to change that threshold for all fields in Pluto just because we're adding new ones, that limitation or that concern still applies to these new assignments, where if it's exactly 10%, especially for MIH, it does not get assigned. And there's a good time to shout out that Pluto is not a legal determination. Pluto is a citywide helpful guide to the qualities of lots. And like anything associated with a lot, people can contact the Department of Finance to really find out for sure what's there. And in this case with MIH areas, there are other avenues to investigate and make a determination about whether a lot qualifies for the MIH program. So lots in MIH areas. There's another interesting problem here where some lots have more than one MIH area associated with it. And I love this screenshot because it's highlighting something that Alice put together pretty quickly, which was a custom way for us to, as an agency, investigate these lots. So this is an internal tool that Alex put together to focus on this particular problem that came in really handy and is just gorgeous with the color choices and base map. So this is a particular lot that has, I think, 2 buildings on it, but certainly has 2 MIH areas, 2 MIH options, at least, associated with it that was for some reason, and there's only so much we can do with source data, are 2 distinct MIH areas. And what do we do about that? In addition, these MIH areas have many attributes. What you're seeing on the right is handy tool in open data where you can query data and also group by and do all types of aggregations that you might do in SQL or Python, but you can do right in the open data portal. These are the counts of distinct values in the MIH option column of data. And so maybe you can quickly notice there are some option space 1, there's some option 1 with no space. There's a lot more variety here than we expected. And so one new Pluto column very quickly became clear would not be enough to address what Pluto, not Plutop, users need to know. Sorry for the typo. And MIH areas have names, they have options, they have other attributes that people might want to know. The ULURP number, I don't know if I'd prefer if people know what that acronym is or pray for the people that do know what ULURP is, but it's an attribute of an MIH area that's associated with the process that people go through to create these areas. Zoning actions, as I mentioned before. The ZAP project number, the zoning application portal, it's a DCP portal that's used to initiate and track zoning applications, zoning actions, and the MIH option. This is a screenshot again of open data of the columns associated with the MIH data, project name, date adopted. These are all things people can find out on open data. Which ones are important to add to Pluto? Not a straightforward question. So what we ended up with were 4 flag columns that indicate whether a lot has option 1, 2, 3, and or 4 associated with it. We're not including the MAH area names or the ULURP number or things like that. These were difficult choices, but we felt, especially talking with the housing team, with people who use this type of data and talk to people who use this type of data, that flagging, that adding 4 columns, as hard as it is to add more columns to a 100-column data set, was worth it. And that the choice to add the flags was more important than the name for people to then have to go look and see what those options are. So what you're seeing are screenshots from software we use very often. It's called dbeaver. We use it to connect to, crazy name, just like Python, just like all these open source tools, but we use it to connect to our databases and query them and explore data. And so these are just a few lots and some of the results where it's either no or 1. That's our choice so far about how to flag these things. And what you're seeing at the bottom is the counts of these combinations. And other than having no MIH area, which is by far the most common occurrence, the most common occurrence seems to be option 1 and option 3. And there are about 5,000 lots where those are the MIH options associated with that lot. And so this is just sorted by count, and there's a helpful percentage here, but most lots are not in MIH areas. So that was more straightforward than transit zones. Still interesting because, especially with the usability side, what do people need? And so I'm just gonna wrap up for us and talk about what we talked about, just to review, and then some of the lessons learned and things that we took away from this. So we talked about City of Yes, transit zones, MIH areas, all coming together to become new Pluto fields. We talked about why and how we added them, and we would love to talk more about the technical details with people that are interested. But first, just to say again, this wasn't simple. We're dealing with handcrafted, as I like to call them, geospatial source data, especially those transit zones. And handcrafted because of feasibility. It's not straightforward to automate. And I think in some cases, there's a good argument that you wouldn't want to just automate the creation of things as important as transit zones. We had to deal with tax blocks versus city blocks. We say city blocks. There's a concept of a zoning block in the zoning resolution. Thankfully, it does seem to categorically align with what we say when we mean blocks. What is considered intersecting, as you can see in screenshot about an MIH area on the bottom left, and that standalone transit zone lot that is the last oddity out of the nearly 900,000 lots in the city. Intersecting is not as straightforward as you'd like it to be. And the relevant zoning text is complicated. And taking a shot at programmatically encoding the zoning text in Pluto is always going to be a tough endeavor. And so some of the takeaways for us were especially about the process of working with other people. So discovering complications and outcomes after trying things is not unique, is not something to be ashamed of. It's something that we plan for. We want to get our hands dirty first and see what actually happens when we try the simple thing. And then without frequent informal chats with experts, this would have taken much longer. So if people have some concept of you can know everything up front, plan accordingly, say this is going to take 3 months and then come back in 3 months and it better be done, is just not realistic or healthy or fun. And so thankfully we have people in DCP who want to talk to us frequently and want to see edge cases that we could look through together to ground our development and ground everyone's expectations about the results and how long things are going to take. And just to shout out the layers of ambiguity that are inherently part of this process. We're talking about source data that is imperfect, transformations, the code that we write that can be imperfect, of course, as deterministic as code can be, and outputs. And so complexity and ambiguity adds up over time through that. But hopefully we're doing things that are explainable. And just a few more takeaways. There's always a trade-off between scale and precision. We're talking about 900 lots. We said about 10 outliers where really just that's more the scale of outliers that we're talking about. And that gets back to the concept of correction. If we had to do correction, we still want it to be a low number and for us to not have to expect to do corrections every single release. And so the value of Pluto is its scale and nearly 100 columns, but you're going to lose precision when you are doing things that are citywide. Pluto, as I said before, Pluto isn't a legal determination. That's freeing for us, but it's still hard to put something authoritative out like this and still say that with a big disclaimer, this is helpful, but if you really need to confirm something, go to the relevant agencies. And so another thing I wanted to shout out related to the application that Alex developed for us to look at lots, there's a difference between routine QA and development QA. If we're doing this every month, we can't bug the experts multiple times a week or multiple times a month about edge cases. And so when it's time to create these fields for the first time, we can engage frequently and heavily in development QA, but for routine QA, that really requires a different process where we're flagging edge cases with the people that do the routine QA, that they know enough to be concerned about certain ones or ignore certain ones. And so we're always still working to improve routine QA, but I think it's important for people in the audience like us who do this type of work to think about these two things as different. And as always, we care about data's usability and the spirit of the law it represents. That's why it's really fun to talk to people like transportation team and the housing team to talk about things like blocks. What do you think we should do? You guys were part of the creation of this zoning resolution text amendment. What's the spirit of it? What should we feel comfortable doing that would satisfy the spirit of the law if it can't satisfy verbatim the law? And usability, again, speaks to things like what type of columns do people actually want for things like MIH areas. And so thank you for listening to all of this and learning all of this with us. This is, I think, the first time we've, as two people on this team, added columns to Pluto. And it's always really satisfying to contribute to a data set that so many people use. But yeah, happy to take a look in the chat. Alex, I'm not sure if we got any big new questions in there or also taking questions for people.
Yeah, Sue has a question, which is about just ambiguous cases and whether we expect to revisit them in the future with protocols. I think inevitably with Pluto especially, we do get inquiries. And so if something is wrong, we will sometimes hear about it from the public or developers. But it's also an interesting case in the MIH areas and transit zones. Those data sets are maintained in-house. And I think with something like transit zones, ideally they don't change. Like the transit zones aren't going to change, and there shouldn't be too much change in the lots underneath them. But there is a potentially virtuous feedback loop that might happen between our teams where maybe we can say that, and actually this did happen in the development of transit zones where like a transit zone kind of is bisecting tax lots in a way that could be drawn more clearly. And so transportation and housing are going to redraw some maps with that in mind. So there's potential for slightly tighter integration between these data sets and specifically the boundaries in them.
And thank you, Matt, for tackling part of that FAR related question.
Thanks, Matt, in general. Part of this was just, like Damon and I are not lawyers, we're programmers. And so a large part of this development process was just getting on a call with people like Matt and with our transportation and housing team. And just those calls were very fun, actually. Yeah, so thanks, Matt. Oh, and just one other thing to shout out is just that all of the code that we write for this is open source in our repo, which we can chat. It'll link in the chat.
Yeah, and I guess just to repeat and shout out why we have so many interesting pictures of lots in this presentation. Alex and I especially, we live in a world where we're looking at code all the time. Sometimes we're looking at tables of the data we're moving, but we're talking about geospatial data. And sometimes just seeing something on a map, a picture's worth 1,000 words, just tells you a whole lot more than staring at that table for 2 hours or rewriting SQL queries and Python scripts to try and handle edge cases and things like that. And as fun as it is to use our main skills of programming and data modeling, looking at things on a map really is inherently satisfying and super, super useful. And yeah, to answer your question about QGIS, partially, some people, and we certainly use QGIS as our default. ArcMap, which is now deprecated, and ArcPro, the two Esri products, are very much used in DCP. As always, there are pros and cons to paid proprietary software. And so I don't know and that I might have a good gut sense of what percentage of people are using QGIS versus ArcPro, but I think it's fair to say that ArcPro, I think, is more popular at DCP than QGIS. But it seems like when people are coming in and just starting at DCP, they have more experience with QGIS because it's been free and available to them, especially in undergrad and master's or PhD programs. So we love QGIS. Alex and I use it because we're on MacBooks and can't access ArcPro, or it's just faster. And as he said, we are the open source team. And so whenever we can use QGIS, we'd rather use it. But it's got its pros where things really look pretty and are powerful. So really cool that you can run Python scripts pretty easily in QGIS too. And on the open source front, thankfully, a lot of the data, as you can see here, that we're dealing with is public data already. Technically, the finance data that we're dealing with is not public. We selectively choose which parts become public, and DOF appreciates that we do that, and thankfully still lets us do that. But a lot of city agencies don't have the luxury of dealing with public data. And so we can make our code public, we can use open source tools and things like that, especially because we're dealing with public data. And so I always want to give other agencies a shout for dealing with more complicated situations than we are and still doing their best to use open source tools when they can. We got a couple new questions. I'm a software engineer. If you're interested about urbanism, what are the best places for devs to get involved? I think using this data and making public your process, your results, puts you, I think, in a very unique, impactful position to just share your process, to give the people who produce the data information, oh, that column was annoying to use. We should probably think about improving that column. So using the data that we're putting out goes a long way in advertising, in building up your skills so that whenever you're moving from one job to the next, you have pretty unique experience, because I'm sure a lot of people do this in undergrad and programs like that. But I think using the data is certainly the best first step to get involved. And Alex and I have always wanted to enable people to contribute to our code. We're not at the stage yet where that's as straightforward as more popular open source projects. But anytime you see something, especially if you're combing through our repo and have ideas and want to get involved, we really want to engage with people that want to directly help with at least our side of things. And so, yeah, using data is getting involved. Alex, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, just the only other thought that I had was getting involved in a professional capacity. And then outside of that, I can just say from personal experience, the only time I've really used our data outside of this was when engaging with, say, friends and family or just colleagues, especially about things in the news. So I don't know how many of you had the experience of becoming some slightly keyboard warriors during the ballot proposals. I found myself actually down pulling our data and aggregating things. And I actually found it quite difficult to talk about affordability and aggregate for units. And hopefully our changes make that a little easier. But yeah, just from personal experience, I think non-professionally, or side of a professional context, I should say, it's just, if there's something engaging or infuriating in the news, usually there's some interesting data about it. A lot of it resides on open data.
And another explicit way to get involved for a dev is to come work for the city. Alex and I, we don't happen to work at DCP. We chose DCP, and there are plenty of other agencies where we'd be happy too. But to improve the accuracy and access to this type of data, it seems like the most impactful place to do that is working for the agencies that are responsible for it. So keep an eye out for job postings across the city that really align with your interests and skills. And thanks, Matt, for shouting out the 80-20 split between ArcGIS and QGIS users.
Yeah, this is news to me. I need to meet these 20 so we can form an emotional support group for the QGIS UI.
Thank you for the thank yous, everyone.
Cheers, all.